In September of 1519, 5 small ships and around 270 men sailed out of Spain to attempt something no one in history had ever done: to sail all the way around the entire planet. 3 years later, a single battered ship limped home, crewed by just 18 starving survivors. They were the first human beings to circle the world. And the man who led them, the man whose name the whole voyage carries, was not among them. He had died violently halfway around the globe. His name was Ferdinand Magellan. This is the story of the most punishing, most ambitious voyage of the entire age of exploration. Let's get into it. To understand why anyone would attempt something so insane, you have to remember where we left off. Columbus had sailed west looking for Asia and run straight into 2 unknown continents. Da Gama had reached the riches of the East the other way, around Africa. Both routes were now open, but there was still one enormous prize and one enormous problem. The prize was the Spice Islands. Far out in the east, in what is now Indonesia, lay a tiny cluster of islands, the Moluccas, that were the only source on Earth of cloves, nutmeg, and mace. These spices were worth more than their weight in gold. Whoever controlled them controlled the most valuable trade on the planet. The problem was getting there. Portugal already owned the eastern route, around Africa and across the Indian Ocean. Spain was locked out of it. But what if you could reach the Spice Islands by sailing west, the way Columbus had tried, somehow getting past or through the Americas that had blocked his path? If a passage existed, a way through that wall of land, then Spain would have its own road to the spices. And nobody knew if such a passage was even real. The man who swore he could find it was, of all things, Portuguese. Ferdinand Magellan was a hardened soldier and sailor who had spent years fighting and trading in the east, all the way out to Malacca, the gateway to the Spice Islands. He had seen the riches of Asia with his own eyes. He was tough, experienced, and absolutely convinced that a strait through the Americas existed, somewhere down in the far south. But Magellan had fallen out badly with the King of Portugal. He'd been wounded in service, walked with a permanent limp, and felt cheated of the reward and recognition he believed he was owed. So he did what Columbus had done a generation before. He took his idea to a rival crown. He carried his plan across the border to the young King of Spain, Charles I, and offered him the keys to the spice trade. Charles said yes. And so a Portuguese captain set out to win the Spice Islands for Spain, an act his own countrymen saw as treason. The Portuguese crown would spend the whole voyage trying to sabotage him. Magellan was given 5 ships: the Trinidad, his flagship, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Little Santiago, around 270 men from across Europe. In late September of 1519, the fleet sailed from Spain, crossed the Atlantic, and began working its way down the long eastern coast of South America, searching bay by bay for a way through to the other side. It did not go well. Every wide opening they found, every promising gulf, turned out to be just another river mouth or dead-end bay. The great estuary of the Rio de la Plata swallowed weeks of searching before it too proved to be a dead end. The coast just kept going south and south, into colder and colder waters. And as it did, the doubts on board began to curdle into something dangerous. The Spanish captains under Magellan had never trusted their Portuguese commander, and now, freezing and lost at the bottom of the world, they turned on him. They decided to spend the brutal southern winter dug in at a bleak harbor called Puerto San Julian. And there, the resentment finally boiled over into open mutiny. 3 of his 5 ships rose against him. Magellan's response was swift and merciless. Through a mix of bluff, loyal men, and sheer ruthlessness, he retook the ships. 1 mutinous captain was killed in the fighting. Another was executed, and a 3rd was marooned, left behind on that empty shore as the fleet sailed on. Magellan had crushed the rebellion, but it tells you the price of command on a voyage like this. You held your men together with iron or you died. That winter brought stranger things too. On the desolate Patagonian coast, the crew encountered native people so tall that the Europeans, in awe, called them giants and named the land Patagonia. And it brought more loss. The Santiago, sent ahead to scout, was wrecked in a storm. They were down to 4 ships, and they had not yet even found the passage they had crossed an ocean to find. Then, in October of 1520, more than a year after leaving Spain, they found it. A narrow opening in the coast that didn't end. They pushed into it, and it kept going, a twisting, freezing maze of channels, cliffs, and dead ends, winding for some 350 miles between the snow and the Black Mountains at the very tip of South America. To the south, they could see fires burning in the night, the campfires of native people, and so they named that land Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire. For over a month, they felt their way through this labyrinth, not knowing if it led anywhere at all. It nearly broke the fleet for good. Inside the strait, the crew of the San Antonio, the largest of the remaining ships, gave up. They turned their vessel around in secret and deserted, sailing all the way back to Spain with a huge share of the expedition's food. Magellan, now down to 3 ships and unknowingly robbed of his supplies, pushed on anyway. And at last, the channels opened up. The fleet sailed out from between the cliffs and into open water, a vast, calm, endless sea stretching west to the horizon. Magellan wept. After everything, he had found the passage. That strait still carries his name today. And the calm ocean before him was so peaceful after the storms of the strait that he gave it a name of his own, the Pacific. It was the cruelest name in history, because Magellan had no idea how big the Pacific was. Nobody did. He expected to reach the Spice Islands in a few days, maybe a couple of weeks. Instead, the fleet sailed into the largest ocean on Earth, an expanse of water wider than all the land on the planet combined. And for 3 months and 20 days, they saw almost nothing but water. The food ran out. Then it ran out properly. The survivors left us accounts of what those weeks were like, and they are some of the most harrowing words in the age of sail. They ate the ox hides that wrapped the rigging, soaking them in seawater for days to soften them enough to chew. They ate sawdust. They paid fortunes for the rats that ran through the holds and counted themselves lucky to catch one. Their gums swelled up over their teeth with scurvy until they could not eat at all, and they died one after another and were slipped over the side into that beautiful, indifferent ocean. That they did not all die is something close to a miracle. By sheer terrible luck, their route across that immense sea missed nearly every island in it. When they finally made landfall, first at Guam and then, in March of 1521, in the islands we now call the Philippines, the men were skeletal, half-dead, and almost feral with hunger. But they had crossed the Pacific. They were now, though they could scarcely believe it, on the far side of the world, approaching the east from the west, exactly as the dream had promised. For Magellan, arriving in the Philippines was a kind of homecoming, and it went to his head. Years before, he had sailed to this part of the world from the other direction, from the west via Portugal's route. His Malay servant, a man named Enrique, was from these waters, and suddenly the local languages were familiar to him again. In a real sense, Enrique may have been the first person in history to travel the whole way around the world and arrive back among people who could understand him. Magellan threw himself into the role of conqueror and missionary. He befriended a local king on the island of Cebu, converted him and his people to Christianity, and then, fatally, agreed to fight that king's enemies to prove the power of his God. On the small island of Mactan, against the advice of his own men, he led a reckless attack on a defiant chief named Lapu-lapu. It was a disaster. Magellan and a small party of armored Europeans waded ashore into shallow water and were swarmed by a far larger force of islanders. Cut off from their boats, Magellan was struck down in the surf, surrounded, and killed. On the 27th of April, 1521, the man who had found the strait, crossed the Pacific, and led the greatest voyage of the age, died on a beach he could not even hold, more than a year's sailing from home, with the goal of his life still out of reach. What was left of the expedition nearly fell apart. A few days later, the king of Cebu, their supposed ally, turned on them and massacred a large number of the crew at a banquet. They were now so few that they could no longer even sail 3 ships. They burned the Concepcion rather than let it fall into the wrong hands, and the 2 survivors, the Trinidad and the Victoria, finally limped into the Spice Islands at last, in November of 1521. There, in the place that had cost so many lives, they did the strangely small thing they had crossed the world to do. They bought cloves. They filled their holds with the spice. The 2 ships tried to go home by different routes. The Trinidad attempted to sail back east across the Pacific, failed, and was eventually captured by the Portuguese. That left 1 ship, the Victoria, under the command of a former mutineer named Juan Sebastián Elcano, to attempt the impossible, to finish the circle, to sail home the long way west all the way across the Indian Ocean and around the southern tip of Africa, straight through waters controlled by the Portuguese, who would hang them all as traitors if they were caught. So Elcano did not stop. He drove that single, leaking, undermanned ship across the Indian Ocean without resupply, around the Cape of Good Hope in the teeth of the storms, and up the long Atlantic coast of Africa, while the crew starved all over again and died one by one. They were so afraid of capture that they didn't dare put into a friendly port until they absolutely had to. And then, on the 6th of September, 1522, the Victoria sailed into a harbor in Spain. 18 men were aboard, gaunt and broken, out of the roughly 270 who had set out 3 years before. They were so weak they could barely stand, and they had just become the first human beings ever to sail all the way around the world. In one of history's grim ironies, the spices packed into that one surviving ship were worth so much that they very nearly paid for the entire expedition. 5 ships and hundreds of lives, and the clove cargo of the last one almost balanced the books. But the real cargo the Victoria carried home was knowledge. The world was now, for the first time, truly known to be a single connected globe, and a far, far larger one than anyone had dared to imagine. The oceans were all one ocean. You really could leave in one direction and come home from the other. The chronicler of the voyage, an Italian named Antonio Pigafetta, who somehow survived the whole ordeal and wrote it all down, even noticed something baffling when they got home. Their careful daily logs were a full day behind everyone on shore. By sailing west around the world, they had quietly lost a day to the turning of the earth. It was the first time humanity ran headlong into that strange truth, and it pointed the way to the time zones and the date line we still use today. So how do we weigh Magellan? He was like the others, a tangle of brilliance and brutality. He was a magnificent navigator and an iron-willed leader who held a doomed expedition together by force, and he was also a man who crushed mutinies with executions and died in a pointless fight he had picked himself. He never completed the circle in a single voyage. Elcano and those 18 survivors did that. And yet it was Magellan's vision and Magellan's Strait that made it possible at all. What that one surviving ship proved was the final piece of the puzzle. In the span of a single generation, a handful of voyages had stitched the whole planet together. Africa rounded, India reached, a new world found, and now the entire globe encircled. The map of the world, blank and terrifying just a lifetime earlier, was suddenly whole. And that's the thought that stays with me. By 1522, the great age of discovery had, in a sense, succeeded completely. Every ocean had been opened. The world was one. The hard part, the question of what human beings would actually do with a connected planet, was only just beginning. Because opening the world was one thing. What Europe built on top of it, the empires, the gold and silver, the conquests, and the vast and terrible trade in human beings, would reshape everything for everyone for centuries to come, right down to the world you and I live in today. Next time, in the final episode of our journey through the age of exploration, we look at what all of this actually unleashed. The world these voyages truly made in all its wonder and all its horror. The conclusion of the story. If you've enjoyed sailing with me, subscribe and I'll see you there for the last one.